Well, my subject for this keynote is actually fairly simple, that food is crucial. It seems obvious. I mean, we all know that we need food to survive, but actually when you think of it, in the financial markets, food is not a big subject. Of course, there are some commodities that are related to food, but food transformation or production in the equity market almost doesn't exist. It's very small, it's very unappealing. Also, the production, the distribution of food has actually a lot of physical impact on the world. Of course, we get reminded of that at the moment with the Ukrainian war, but on biodiversity, it's even worse. It's actually the main source of impact. So that's why I'll start with a quick reminder about biodiversity. That biodiversity is not just the different species that we can see, for instance, in a zoo, or that can get counted in some indices like the Living Planet Index, for instance. Actually, according to the global UN definition of biodiversity, there's also the genetic diversity. So the fact that within a species, you have different types of individuals, which makes it more resilient. For instance, at the moment in France, we have the bird flu, and already 14 million of birds have been slaughtered since the beginning of the year. So that clearly comes from an absence of diversity in the genes. And of course, the last one is the diversity of ecosystems, where once we've lost the last coral reefs, well, we won't have coral reefs forever because we cannot repopulate them. So biodiversity has many features. It also gives lots of very different services to humanity, to mankind. There are four main types of services. The first one we can think of course, is provisioning, getting food or getting wood from nature. But then there are the cultural aspects, the fact of having zoos or reserves that we can travel to. There is regulation. For instance, the regulation of pollination. If we didn't have the bees, 70 out of the 100 top vegetables that are being eaten by men actually wouldn't exist. And the last one is supporting other systems. For instance, capturing carbon, which of course is related to the change in climate. That explains why actually when you look at biodiversity, it has links with many other subjects for humanity, and usually they go in vicious circles. One of them is related to all that goes with climate. As the climate deteriorates, species die, and because they die, actually you get to store less carbon, which in turn makes the climate issue worse. The same goes for many social elements, because people who actually depend on nature most are actually the poorer people. And if nature gets destroyed, it's for them that it actually becomes a problem. If you look at the Ukrainian crisis, for instance, well, there is a problem with wheat, for instance, but it won't be in Europe. It will be in Africa, it will be in Ethiopia. So, of course, this financial problem, which is that the commodities price is going up, which, by the way, is not a problem if you're investing in commodities. It's rather a problem if you need to buy them. Well, then it turns into a social problem, which in turn can lead to far worse situations with movements of population. So now if we go actually to the real problem beyond and start speaking about quantification, because that's the important point for us, OCIAM, because, well, we are a quant manager. Well, in terms of mean species abundance, which is one of the metrics that is most widely used to measure globally biodiversity, which actually reflects 100% if all of the world were pristine nature, and goes down to 0 if all were transformed into a parking lot, or at least a situation where there is no original species left from the original state. So this measure, which is used in the Globio model, used by IPCC, and in the different scenarios used by the UN, well, we consider that we should be at 72% for the development of mankind to be sustainable. You can see that we are already below that at around 68%. And the central scenarios, actually, we are going down to 58% by 2050. So the situation is dire. Of course, it's even worse in Europe, because in Europe, well, one way to understand this figure is that we've already transformed 2/3 of Europe into a parking lot, the rest being pristine nature. So the situation is dire, and when we look at the kind of discussions that there are at worldwide level around what should be done, well, the main subject at the moment is a 30-30, to have 30% of Earth transformed into a reserve by 2030. But you see, it's actually very, very far from being enough. I mean, that's not even half of what we would need for the development of man to be actually sustainable. So we have a big problem. And actually, a big part of this problem comes from food. Food has lots of different impacts on biodiversity. Of course, the first one is through the greenhouse gases, but that's not where food is the majority of the subject. We know that transportation uses a lot of oil. On food, it's mostly fertilizers that are actually using indirectly greenhouse gas. The big impact comes from land use. Land use, which can be summed up very simply by not the land that we use to grow crops for us. It's usually the crops we grow for the animals that we will eat. We'll come back to that. And then there are other subjects that are very important. One is the use of water. Water is actually, well, fresh water, a very scarce resource. It is considered that the first wars that there will be around environmental subjects will be around the water. We'll come back to that. Eutrophication is actually also linked to Stickstoff, I think we say in German. So the transformation of the soils that reduces, by the way, the productivity of soils. And of course, biodiversity in terms of number of animals is the theme that is most impacted by agriculture and the growth of livestock. So of course, this is the issue with producing food. But it gets worse and worse because, well, of course, first, the population is growing very rapidly. So in terms of absolute numbers, well, we need roughly 1/3 more food within the next 20 years. And at the same time, we need to reduce the footprint of this food in terms of greenhouse gases, but also in terms of biodiversity. What makes it difficult is that within the food industry as a whole, meat is actually a big part of the issue. So when you look at what is the solution, well, I know there will be discussions about circular economy, lots of other approaches, but the one single effect that is the strongest is the consumption of meat, because animals are actually not that efficient at producing proteins. So if we were to grow the food directly for ourselves, then the impact would be much less. That's important because in terms of land, there is actually a competition already at the moment. You might remember that, for instance, at some point in the US, before they discovered the shale gas, which, by the way, is another question, they had the plan to be independent from the point of view of energy by growing, well, by methanization, by growing oils that actually you could burn in engines. And they had to just scrap that plan because the result was that you would need like 3 times the whole surface of the US just to do that, which obviously was not rational. Well, the same goes for many other issues. You can use the land to do reserves and preserve biodiversity. You can use the land to live on it. You can use the land to grow food, whether it's food for humanity or food for the beefs. But if, well, the surface that we have is still the same. So that's why when we look at the issue, well, the fact that there is a change worldwide in terms of eating habits, well, is a strong problem that comes on top of the growth of the population, which is why actually when we saw the growth of the population, so the need for food is important, but it's even more than what we've seen, because as people get basically richer, they want to eat more meat. So, of course, I've come to almost half of my presentation, and by now the picture I've drawn looks very sad. I mean, that's a problem. It's largely known in different ways. Now, what can we do? Mostly in the financial sector. Well, the first thing that I'd like to highlight that probably some people won't agree with in the future is, well, short supplies and circular economy. Well, it's not enough, because if you eat local, but you eat local beef, it's actually much worse than if you eat vegetables that come from the other side of the planet. Because transportation is not a big part of the impact. It's actually the nature of what you eat. So that's not really a solution. What we really need is a transformation of three things. Both the food industry, and by that I mean the actual existing industry. You cannot consider you will replace the old food industries that exist, given the amounts that we need, just with startups and new companies. So you need to change the industry. But on top of that, we also need to change what we do with the food, the waste, the repartition of it, and you also need to change the diets. You need all those three if we are to, well, this is not graphed in terms of MSA, but if we want to go back to the 72% of biodiversity that we need, that's the sum of what we need. Otherwise, what we'll get is basically wars. So here we see that Ukraine has some impacts on food markets, but of course, this war was not caused by food. But very soon we'll probably have wars that will be caused by food. For instance, in Africa, you've got the Victoria Lake that is drying up, and roughly you have 10 million people living around that lake. And the one thing that is for sure is that when the lake dries down completely, well, either they'll need to move or they will die. It's as simple as that. So the whole notion of what is the importance of the food system, it's not really the price of wheat. It's really, is there enough food? And what geostrategical impact will it have on mankind? And will we be able to defend the last few tons of wheat? So of course, that was still in the problem sphere. Now the financial markets, as I've said, it's very tough to grasp that because, well, we've got the commodities on one end, then we've got also some projects, positive impact, buying land, buying forests to protect it, it's nice, but it's not at all at the scale of the food system globally. It's very, very small. Of course, you can have thematic approaches. We see a lot of those in circular economy funds, or I would say thematic funds. And honestly, I support those. They are nice, but it's only education. The only way we can actually have an actual change in the end is by investing in the present food system and obliging them to actually change the rules. Because as I mentioned, the farmers are not listed. But McDonald's, Nestle, and Danone, all those guys are listed. They have a reputation to defend, and it's actually their biggest asset. So when you engage with those people, you can make them change. And when McDonald's actually changes its rules to select the farmers that will provide the French fries, well, that completely changes the whole industry at once. We've seen that, for instance, in France. So engagement is important. Before that, even, we need education, because all that we've talked here, I think that many people in the general public can see some of those. They can see how sad it is that pandas disappear, or that forest burns, or that bees disappear, and so on. But these are small details. We need to teach about the global measures. We need to teach about MSA and the fact that actually eating beef is the one thing that you can do personally that has the most impact. And those things need a lot of collective engagement. So that's why at OCIAM, at least for the moment, because the subject is not that widespread. The first things we do are collective engagement to try to explain the subjects through global initiatives, like, for instance, the FAIR initiative. And then, of course, what we need to do is explain about measures. As long as we will not have an equivalent to the ton of carbon for climate, biodiversity will only stay a kind of set of pictures, which will never converge to actual policies, at least meaningful policies. So that's why we're defending the use of this MSA, mean species abundancy, which is part of the Globio model, was developed essentially in the Netherlands by the PBL. It's now used in many global scenario schemes, like the IPCC, for instance. And the nice thing about it is that it can be compared. Can be compared from one region to another, as you can see here. You can see the effect of a given project. You can measure it for a given company. And that's actually what we're doing at Oceana, where we have a partnership actually with Iceberg Data Lab, a small fintech that is, I would say, pushing the Globio model one step further to assess companies, actual companies, on 4 pillars of their actual production. So using the actual raw materials that they have, although in a lot of cases you still need to extrapolate those because they are not part of the mandatory disclosures, and that's, by the way, one of the other issues. At the moment we have lots of mandatory disclosures on carbon footprint, ESG, social policies and so on, but the amount of tomatoes that Heinz is using to do ketchup is actually a business secret. We are not completely sure it's actually tomatoes that they are using. And by the way, we are pretty sure that the ones they are using are coming from China. So just to highlight that the indirect ESG in that case and biodiversity impacts of those resources, which we know are very important, are still to a large extent secret. So improving on the disclosure of these actual uses of raw material is important. But still, with this company, we've got a model with 4 pillars, one of which is the climate change, by the way. Land use is one of the original ones from the Globio model, so it works pretty well. And then starting to have things related to eutrophication, so nitrogen, and fresh water. Of course, the plan for this model was that it started with the high-impact sectors, including the food production, and now it's spreading. Of course, the aim is that at some point we can have biodiversity measures, not just for the agricultural sector, but globally for the reportings that we would all love to have, typically on the PAIs. So, I think I'll close with that, and I kept 1.5 minutes for questions.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So in your projections for the meat consumption per capita, which regions of the world are becoming so much richer that their meat consumption per capita would add a further load to the biodiversity loss? So who are the expected largest contributors to that?
Well, in terms of contribution, it's the emerging countries. But the rule, just like in ESG, is the same. As people grow richer, well, they want to live like the Europeans did. And that's a very difficult part in it. Who are we to say that Indians shouldn't have cars, for instance, or that, well, at least in that case, Indians don't eat meat. They are part of the very nice groups in that respect. But that the Chinese or the Africans shouldn't eat more meat as they get richer, it's very difficult. So, we need at least to show the way in that respect. I have put aside the kind of ethical reasons, because there are also ethical reasons. For instance, the Indians don't eat meat out of religious reasons. From the point of view of animal welfare also, I mentioned the 14 million of birds that have been slaughtered this year in France. Well, of course, they are only birds, but even if they were mammals, that would raise a lot of attention. And of course, if they were humans, that would be completely unacceptable. So there are other things that go with it. And there are also technical solutions, producing alternative proteins and such. But honestly, on those subjects of food, we know that obesity is a problem. So the first solution is really to be more sober, to eat less. Thank you very much.